very useful. So let's talk a little bit about the Kirovs, then we'll go a little bit into the Iowa's 80s configuration, and then we'll see how all that compares. We've talked a lot about these ships in World War II and how they compare to other World War II battleships. This is one of the first modern comparisons we're doing, even though it's still contemporary to the Iowas. So first off, the Kirov-class battle cruisers displace about 28,000 tons standard displacement. This is, right in the range of a World War I era battleship or battle cruiser. And they are often termed as battle cruisers themselves because they are larger than a modern cruiser, and they have a very heavy battery. In this case, it's missiles and not guns. And they have no meaningful armor protection. So the term battle cruiser does probably fit for these ships. Even if it doesn't, it's a contemporary term that it's a term that we throw around a lot discussing it. So I'll just stick with what people generally use here. Realistically, it's very different from the battle cruiser that came before it, and there is very clear end to the all-big gunship, and then this one evolving in a completely separate chain. And that evolution is interesting in its own right. The Soviet Union inherited a weak navy from Tsarist Russia. The Russians had a world-class navy. The Japanese defeated it. They tried to compete in the dreadnought arms race, but World War I stopped most of their battleship construction, so their newer ships didn't get completed, and they ended up with just a handful able to fall into the hands of the Soviets. And then during World War II, Russia again had started to build up a battle fleet, and then when Germany invaded, none of those battles were completed, and by the end of the war, the ships that they had in service or had managed to acquire, particularly the ones of any size, had been used up and were no longer any good. In fact, both Great Britain gave the Soviets a battleship, and the Soviets ended up with an Italian battleship, the German aircraft carrier Graf Zeppelin, and a number of other ships. And none of these were able to be maintained through the 50s into the 60s. And so, in the 1980s, the Soviet Navy started to build up, and they had very much been a submarine force throughout the entire Cold War, with a very small number of surface warships, mostly for defense. And with the Carter administration not really pressuring the Soviet Union expanded its navy to try and power project across the world. And that's where Reagan comes in and wants to expand the U.S. Navy to outspend them. And these Kirov-class battle cruisers are very much a part of the Soviet Union's strategy to expand to try and compete with NATO. They can form the core of a surface action group, and the Soviet Navy is trying to do something very different from NATO. We have carrier battle groups. We're going to send a carrier and the aircraft on it to attack an enemy. So the Soviets can't match us by building aircraft carriers and having a traditional carrier battle like you see in World War II, but they can overwhelm that carrier's defenses with mass missile attacks. So a ship like the Kirovs that can launch a huge wave of ballistic missiles or cruise missiles is a good counter for them against an American carrier group. But is it good against an American surface action group? Let's see. So, the Kirovs are, again, very close to battleship size. At 827 feet long, they're only a little bit shorter than an Iowa. 94 feet wide, they're significantly narrower, which gives them a higher length to beam ratio, actually. And they've got a depth of about 30 feet, which, again, shallower than an Iowa. They use a CONAS propulsion system, which is combined nuclear and steam. They've got two propeller shafts, each fed by two nuclear reactors. Those nuclear reactors give them 140,000 horsepower and a speed of about 32 knots. An Iowa-class battleship has 212,000 horsepower to get up to 33 knots, more realistically 32 in the 80s, but that's at a displacement of 30,000 tons more than a Kirov, around 58,000 tons. Because the shock from getting hit can scram your reactors, or other damage can knock out your reactors, the Kirovs also had 2 boilers that could create steam using fuel, much like the nuclear reactors do, and they're fairly comparable to New Jersey's fuel-fired steam system, so that they could have a backup propulsion system if needed. The Soviets do this a lot with their vessels, and having a nuclear propulsion and then also having a backup system if something happens to their nuclear system. They only have a crew of 710, which is less than half of the size of an Iowa-class battleship in the 80s, and a quarter of the size of an Iowa-class battleship during World War II. So that is a much less significant investment. Each one has 3 helicopters, and they have a hangar to embark those helicopters, so that gives them an onboard scouting ability, an anti-submarine ability, and they can perform maintenance on those aircraft. Iowa-class battleships could hold 3 or 4 helicopters, but they've got no hangar to do maintenance or just store them in. And I'm not sure that any were ever officially assigned to the battleship and embarked, or if the battleship's helipads were just used to land helicopters from the other ships in the fleet that did have hangars. So whether or not an Iowa would actually have helicopters on board if it was fighting a Kirov one-on-one is less likely. Kirov would probably have 2 or 3 operational helicopters. In terms of armor plating, the Kirovs are reported to have about 3 inches of armor around their reactor and engineering plants, and nothing more than splinter protection throughout the rest of the hull and superstructure. Iowa-class battleships are going to win this comparison with an armored belt that can stop cruise missiles, and that just being part of a layered defense system. Triple bottom, 5 layers, thick side for torpedo defense. The Iowas are significantly more heavily built and armored. Interestingly, though, armor plating that was added in the 1980s for new computer systems in the superstructure was only 3 inches thick, and it wasn't straight up armor steel like the Class B that much of the ship's World War II armor is made out of. It's HY80, basically submarine hull, high grade steel. So